Good evening. My name is Steve Murillo. I'm the State Section Director for MUFON Los Angeles. We've got a very, very interesting and unusual program for you. Black projects and unusual technology. Mark МакКандлиш grew up and had an interest in aircraft at a very early age. He joined the Air Force and later made use of his GI Bill to attend the Art Center College of Design. He later worked for a short time in the Hollywood special effects business as a matte artist, and then was hired by General Dynamics Corporation in Pomona, California, as a technical illustrator and technical publications editor. During this time, Mark was also given the opportunity to participate in a number of media orientation rides in frontline U.S. Air Force and Air National Guard fighters such as the F-15 Eagle and the F-16 Fighting Falcon. In 1986, MacCandlish became aware that the U.S. was in possession of some extraordinary technologies and began to pursue his own private research into where these technologies came from and how they worked. His research led to many strange events and strange encounters. Tonight, Mark will be sharing his most intriguing stories from his tenure working in the twilight world of futuristic military aircraft. He will reveal all the law will allow about black projects and help us explore the edge where military and alien technologies intersect. Would you all please put your hands together for a warm welcome? Welcome, Mark MacKanдлиш.
Thank you, Steve. Good evening. I'd like to give you a little introduction here. I suppose the question we all have, especially when we see things out in the sky that kind of defy what we consider to be the known realm of physics, we're all left with one big question. You know, where did it come from? Is anybody out there? Is this from some other world? These things that we're seeing. Now, I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I kind of came up with the following stream of thought. That from the time of early man, when we as a species began to have an awareness that extended beyond the necessities of just survival, food, shelter, procreation, and so forth, we looked at the skies with a sense of wonder, bewilderment, and occasionally fear. Astronomical phenomena, not understood from much besides their regularity, were events that foretold the bounty of the harvest, or the demands of a god that could only be pacified through human sacrifice. And depending on the particular culture that you were part of, that might be a sacrifice that you would personally have to make. Some members of these cultures or societies were devoted to observing and cataloging these events. And in a sense, this was the first vestiges of science. This is where it was born. But like so many other aspects of our existence, it was not always possible to know exactly what was really going on. An eclipse of the sun could be interpreted as the death of a god as it was being gobbled up by an evil dragon or something of that nature. From time to time, if some of the ancient texts are to be believed, some of these gods came down and dwelled down from the skies and lived among us. And by some accounts, they arrived in chariots of fire or glided down to the earth, silently riding on a great shield that came from the sky. In other words, a flying saucer. Stories attributed to these beings, whoever they were, suggested that they wielded a power and a technology that was awesome, even by our standards today. Some of the ancient Sumerian texts, translated within the last 50 years or so, speak of events that bear a striking similarity to what might be characterized as the detonation of nuclear weapons or the exploitation of field propulsion technology or anti-gravity. Eventually, we began to innovate using the primitive tools we developed to build structures against the elements and ships that would float upon the water. And weaponization of these various creations soon followed. And since these devices could offer not only a defense against any competing culture, they also gave us the ability to subvert other cultures because of the tactical advantage that these things gave us. But these early machines also made it easier to harvest your crops, transport greater quantities of food to the market for sale, and soon commerce, trade, and the exchange of cultures, beliefs, and technical information began to accelerate. Now, there's some debate as to when the timeline commenced, but I think it's safe to suggest that it began to leave its mark upon the Earth somewhere between 10 to 15,000 years ago. Some researchers, of course, suggest that our history of innovation may go back even further than that, and possibly further than anyone could imagine. So if one accepts that in that relatively short interval, mankind grew out of many different cultures, primitive cultures, to a global society as we have today, where wealth can be transmitted through cyberspace, or one in which we've traveled to the moon, how magical will our technology seem in another 10 or 20,000 years from now? It has been said that our computing technology, when considered in terms of its rate of evolution and exponential growth, that the level of computational power is doubling about every 18 months. Now, this is merely an example of how science and technology is accelerating and proliferating throughout the world. The resources of data available over the internet alone are absolutely staggering. Perhaps one of the sad consequences of this is the degree to which we have become self-absorbed and have lost some of the intuitive insight that we had as a civilization just a few decades ago. Some say we've given up that spiritual part of our nature that will help us as a civilization to keep all of this technological innovation in perspective. And of course, it depends on who you ask. Today, our powers of observation have been expanded, multiplied, and lately there isn't a week that goes by that some astronomer isn't talking about or just announcing the discovery of yet another planet that they've found orbiting a distant star. So it all comes back to the question of whether mankind is alone in the vastness of the universe. After many years of careful observation, it is my studied opinion that we are not alone. Now, when faced with the situation of observing, witnessing, as it were, examples of dynamic flight technologies, far beyond any known capability possessed by man, one can often jump to a conclusion that Earth must be being visited by some sort of off-world civilization. And it's easy to get into an argument with yourself or your intellectual peers that these craft, or whatever they may represent examples of technology developed here on Earth, buried deep in some very, very black classified program of the government, or they may be the most exotic remnants of some ancient, as yet unrevealed, advanced culture hidden away unto itself, say in the impenetrable wilderness of the Andes Mountains of South America. Or it could be interdimensional beings or time travelers from our own future. The possibilities are endless. And if you are objective about all of it, you may conclude that the answer might be somewhere along the lines of all of the above. So how does one go about sorting all this information out? How do these craft work? And it is even possible to navigate the vast distances between one star system and another and do it within the span of several human lifetimes. In my journey of discovery and what follows, I will share with you how I was able to answer some of these profound questions for myself. My first UFO sighting was an evening in the winter of 1966 from a residential area on Westover Air Force Base near Springfield, Massachusetts. And this sighting was, for all I could tell, was just a light in the sky, but it began maneuvering in an unusual way. It didn't appear to be any kind of a typical aircraft or helicopter for that matter. It didn't have any strobe lights flashing around it. These are some of the things that you can use when you're making your own observations about things that are happening in the sky that may seem unusual, is to first look for any kind of anti-collision lights or spotlights on the landing gear if the aircraft is coming into land, say if you're near an airport or a military air base. But in the case of this particular incident, there was a light, a very bright light, that was exhibiting what you might call non-ballistic motion. And so I ran into the house and grabbed a telescope, and I watched this thing through an 80-power reflector telescope for the better part of 10 minutes. And it appeared to be just a glowing ball of plasma with colors swirling all around the surface. It wasn't shooting off sparks. It didn't have any kind of landing lights or marker beacons of any kind on it. And so I watched this for a while, and then suddenly it began to move off, and it got a certain distance away, and then suddenly took off like it had been fired out of a cannon. Now that was a stunning experience for me, and so I suddenly became a big fan of UFOs, and I was collecting articles and bringing them in for show and tell at school, and it wasn't too long before I, like perhaps many of you, began getting those sidelong glances and the snicker under the breath and the ridicule, and you know, sort of a mandate from the teacher that we've seen enough of this, Mark, thank you very much. So, for some reason, after that experience, I just sort of forgot it all. It sort of passed out of my sphere of interest, replaced by things like girls and cars and that sort of thing. Went into the Air Force after high school and studied electronics, worked on weapons control systems on F-106s at McChord Air Force Base up near Fort Lewis in Washington, near Tacoma, Washington. And in this whole intervening time, there hadn't been any sort of sightings or anything that would have sort of rekindled those old thoughts of what I had seen. In fact, I'd completely forgotten those things. But in 1974, in the summer of 1974, our unit, which was an interceptor unit, it was part of the Aerospace Defense Command, which was responsible specifically for the defense of the northern United States, or the North American continent, I should say. We had aircraft that were loaded with nuclear weapons. And they were designed back in the 50s, around the time when I was born, to specifically go out and intercept a Soviet bomber or a fleet of bombers that might be trying to come into the United States and drop their bombs. And so it was a very serious business, and we were all sitting around one afternoon, and we got an announcement over the PA system that said, "Gentlemen, we have a covered wagon. This is not a drill." Now that was code for there's a real live, unknown, unidentified aircraft off the coast, and it's coming this way, and we need to fire up the planes. And we had 4 F-106s, fully armed, sitting in an alert barn, as we called it. We would all go out there with our tool bags, and we would make sure that these planes all fired up and were ready to roll, and they all took off. You could see the afterburners all the way to the horizon. That's how important this was. It was all classified. But within a week or so, one of the guys in our unit got a phone call from a fellow who worked in the control tower at McChord Air Force Base, and he said that there had in fact been some kind of an intercept, and that something that had been a part of that intercept had crashed in the Cascade Mountains to the east of McChord Air Force Base near Mount Rainier. This same fellow from our unit was a very big outdoors enthusiast, had I think it was a C5 Jeep at the time, 4-wheel drive. And so he decided that he was going to go out and see if there was something that really landed out there. And he got the coordinates from his buddy who was at the control tower, of course had the radar that kind of scoped out the entire region. And he got within about 3 miles of this location, and all of a sudden, all of these soldiers in blue uniforms with blue berets and guns and combat boots and some serious, serious weaponry jumped out of the bushes and basically stopped him in his tracks, and they said, "You leave, and you leave now, and don't come back." And so we all knew that something had happened. You don't just throw a bunch of soldiers out in the forest for no reason at all. There had to be something that came down. Well, it wasn't until years later I had occasion to talk to William Cooper, who wrote a book, I think it was called Behold a Pale Horse. And he talked about his career in the Navy. And it turns out that the Bremerton shipyards, where his submarine was based, was just maybe 80 miles away from where we were stationed. And as it happens, and this is something that you kind of put things together years later, and you can go back and you can kind of see how all the puzzle pieces fit together. But in this particular instance, at the very time that our planes were out intercepting something, and something was crashing in the mountains near Mount Rainier, his submarine was on its way to Hawaii.
And in the course of one evening, probably the night before what our unit was tasked with, something very big came out of the water and flew away. And it was seen from the deck of the submarine while it was on the surface. So it just goes to show you that as members of MUFON or people who are interested in this sort of thing, is that it's always a good idea to keep a record. I mean, even if it's just something that you see once in a lifetime, you never know when you might run into somebody who says, hey, you know what, I was there. I was like 2 blocks down the street from you and I saw the same thing. What night of the week was that? Nobody remembers. Well, it's funny because if you take the time to make a note of what day of the week it was, what time of the night it was, what it looked like, you might even be able to get together with somebody who's, say, a half a mile away. And if you can take a compass and plot what the angle, versus the north-south, latitude would be, and the person at the other end of that triangle can do the same thing, you can determine by triangulation how far away the object is. And then, if you can both say, well, in my instance, well, at arm's length, it was about 4 inches long. And the other guy says, well, in my case, it was 2 inches long. So you can make a map of how far away it was. And you can even figure out, with a fair amount of accuracy, how big the object was based on this kind of basic geometry. And so this intercept that occurred in 1974 off the coast of Washington, it stuck in the back of my mind for a while as just something odd, something unusual. About 3 years later, I was using a GI Bill. I went through Art Center College of Design and worked for a short time in the special effects industry, and I eventually began doing work for a variety of defense contractors. These are a few examples. I actually did some editorial work as well for a number of magazines, including Popular Mechanics and Popular Science. But in each of these instances, what these experiences did was that they gave me an idea of the kinds of really advanced technology that was going on in the defense industry, things that the average person doesn't know anything about. There are things that I can share with you about the level of technology that we have right now that's considered to be state-of-the-art, and yet some of it's actually on the verge of being obsolete when compared with the true level of technological advancement that we have. So after a while, when you see these things flying around the sky, you start to ask yourself, is this just something that we've built and is real secret and classified and we just don't know anything about it yet because it's so secret? Or is this something that's strayed from military airspace that is part of a flight test program? I mean, I've talked to people who had relatives living in Apple Valley up near Victorville. In that particular area in the 60s and 70s was actually kind of a makeshift flight test area. It was actually outside of the military airspace for Edwards Air Force Base, but because it's so desolate out there, they didn't have any qualms about flight testing aircraft or even doing training missions that went into these other areas. And I've actually talked to people who saw things coming and going from Edwards Air Force Base that looked exactly like alien technology, flying saucers and what have you. So I spent some time working in General Dynamics. I had a secret security clearance. It matched the level of security clearance that I had while I was in the Air Force. And I had all the electronics training from when I was in the Air Force. So I began to see and understand more about these different systems, and it enabled me to work with a variety of contractors so that I could not only listen to the engineers talk about what these systems were supposed to do, but how they actually worked. And being a curious sort of person, it really helped me to kind of flesh this thing out. During that time, I actually had occasion to take a number of orientation rides with the military and actually participate in flight training courses where we would go out and we'd drop fake bombs on a target, or we'd rendezvous with an in-flight refueling aircraft, and got to take photographs of all this stuff, which I had originally planned to show you, save for the problems we had with the flights coming down from San Francisco today. So anyway, these experiences gave me a better handle, a better perspective on what the military does, how it thinks, how it operates, how it keeps some things away from the public eye, how it keeps some things up front to, you know, inspire people to wave the flag and say, you know, isn't this great? You know, we have all this wonderful defensive capability. And then, in around 1986, after I left General Dynamics and I began freelancing for a variety of different defense contractors, I received a call from Lockheed Martin. Well, actually, at that time, it was still Lockheed. And I was asked by a gentleman who worked at that facility to do some conceptual artwork of a new aircraft. It was referred to as the second generation in a family of aircraft that had been in deployment for quite some time. And at this time, you may have heard some of the rumors. There were these sonic booms coming over Southern California, and they were traveling at speeds that were something in the neighborhood of Mach 4, Mach 5. You could track the sonic boom by using earthquake sensors on the ground because it was that powerful and it was that fast. And all of this seemed like a big giveaway that there was something that had superseded the fastest aircraft that we knew of at the time, which was the SR-71 Blackbird. Now, there are a number of, number of aircraft. I'm just going to fast forward through some of this stuff here. There are a number of aircraft that, here we go. This is the XP-70. This is an aircraft. It was built entirely of stainless steel. It has 6 huge engines buried in this in a cell that's under the center line of the aircraft. And aside from the SR-71 Blackbird, this particular aircraft had a capability somewhere in the vicinity of Mach 3, which was, I mean, so hot, so fast, I should say, that the leading edges of the wings would actually start to glow. And this is also true, of course, of the SR-71. Anyway, so I'm asked by these folks who cannot tell me what the second generation of this aircraft looks like to come up with something that looks really, really fast. And so I took this aircraft here and the SR-71 Blackbird, and I combined the features of the two aircraft, and I came up with something that looked approximately like this. When I went back to the facility and showed them this drawing, sans the little parasitic aircraft that's sitting on the back end there, they had brought in 2 engineers that were sitting across from me who I subsequently identified as 2 of the luminaries of Lockheed engineering. They were contemporaries of Ben Rich and was it Jack Kelly, or what was the other gentleman? Kelly Johnson. Sorry, just slipped my mind there for a second. Anyway, these gentlemen were contemporaries of this fellow, and so I laid out my sketch pad and I showed it to these gentlemen, and they both suddenly got this very nervous look on their faces. One actually got red in the face, and you could almost see the beads of perspiration beginning to form on his forehead, and his hands began to shake, and he was looking at my drawing, and he was saying, well, what are those canards doing on there? Those are the little wings in the front. Well, those will be torn off at Mach 7. And he started to say 17. Mach 17. Now, I'm not an aeronautical engineer, but I know that that's got to be something around 15,000 miles an hour or higher. But the funny thing is that after I explained to them what my thinking was about how this particular aircraft was kind of just a combination of the features that I found in 2 of the other aircraft that, you know, me and my simplicity knew about as an artist, you know, I felt that it was logical that they would have those kinds of features. And so they tried to dissuade me from believing that any of that was possible, that you could have these vertical stabilizers out on the wingtips, so that you could have canards or any of those kinds of things. And it wasn't more than about 4 years later that there was actually a near-miss collision with a commercial airliner flying near Edwards Air Force Base as an object, an aircraft that looked just like this was climbing out of Edwards Air Force Base. So then I understood why this gentleman became so upset and became so nervous. But in the process of discussing all the features of this aircraft and all the things that they wanted me to incorporate into the artwork that I did for them, which I have never seen since, it's still classified. But one of the things that this gentleman told me was, well, you know, we've had another version of this aircraft in operation for a number of years. Now remember, this is 1986, which means that we're right in the middle of the Reagan administration. And the timeline that I've picked up from other sources indicate that there was a development program for this first generation aircraft, which I later found to be the Aurora aircraft program, or family of aircraft. That this aircraft bore a striking resemblance to one of the things that Kelly Johnson had described as the hopeless diamond. Let's see here. Sorry to jump around like this. Okay. Yeah, I'm going in the wrong direction, I'm sorry. Pardon me. This is unrehearsed. Okay. This is what the aircraft, the first generation Aurora, looked like. And this is not by any means a great illustration, but at least it gives you the basic components of the system and how it worked. And it wasn't until years later that I even came across this information. In fact, this is a drawing that I did for Aviation Week in Space Technology because they began accumulating information themselves. But the aircraft, as it was described to me by this Lockheed employee, had been on a mission that was bringing it back to Edwards Air Force Base. And in the process of bringing this aircraft in, there are two different propulsion systems on this aircraft. One is a series of 4 engines that are embedded in the body of the aircraft, and you can kind of see the inlets and the exhausts that are the 4 nacoducts that are on either side, and then the 4 trapezoidal-shaped panels in the back that are just past the midline. But those were basically the inlets and the outlets of 4 big engines that would launch the thing from a runway. And that the aircraft would be brought up to something around Mach 2. And then the next step of this process was that line that you see that runs across the widest point of the fuselage is actually a line of what look like fuel injectors, but they're all pointing outward. And if you look at this in the side view, you can see that what happens is that when this thing gets up to a certain speed, you have the air flowing across the front of the aircraft and being compressed by the displacement of the aircraft at such a tremendous velocity that the entire aircraft would melt if it wasn't made out of space shuttle tiles, because the entire aircraft is covered with space shuttle tiles, the ceramic tiles that ablate the heat. But when the air rushes across the surface of the aircraft, it becomes so hot. All you have to do is just spray the fuel into the airstream, and boom, it blows up. And when it does, it expands between the supersonic shock wave that comes off of that ridge at the center of the aircraft and the tapered afterbody of the vehicle. So basically, it pinches the aircraft, top and bottom, and it drives it forward at tremendous velocity. Now, when this fellow explained to me that there was an aircraft like this coming into Edwards Air Force Base, he indicated that this aircraft was in trouble and the pilot was having difficulty cycling from one propulsion system to the other, so he couldn't land it. So he was instructed to take it out over the ocean, and if he couldn't correct the problem, to just put it into the water and destroy it so that it would never be found. What he said was, the aircraft took 15 minutes to get from Edwards Air Force Base to Hawaii before he was able to turn around. Now, he must have thought, he's an artist, he doesn't know anything about engineering, blah, blah, blah. Well, if you can go, and I had gone scuba diving that year in Hawaii, so I knew it was 3,000 miles from Edwards Air Force Base. Well, if you can go 3,000 miles in 15 minutes, that means you're traveling at 12,000 miles an hour. And this was in 1986. So, and then the new drawing, the new thing that I was preparing for them was supposed to be capable of something in the area of 17,000 miles an hour. It's a tremendous velocity. It's a kind of velocity that you would normally associate with UFOs. And so it stands to reason that when you're outside late at night and you see a bright light zipping across the sky at, a seemingly very high velocity, it could be a satellite or it could be one of these things. Because, in spite of everything they'll tell you about whether it's burning hydrogen or methane or this fuel or that fuel, the afterbody of the aircraft glows from the heat of the exhaust. Whether the fuel itself produces a bright flame that you can see is irrelevant, because the back end of this thing glows like a big ember of charcoal in a barbecue when it lights up. In fact, Years later, a witness that had actually had a chance to walk under and around this aircraft had told me that they had decided to pulse the burst of fuel out of the back end of this aircraft because it was eroding the tiles on the tail end of this aircraft so severely and so quickly that it was just about ready to burn the tail end off the aircraft. So they would pulse it in 5-second intervals with a 10-second rest in between. Now, the transition between the internal jet engines and the external burning mechanism, which is very similar to what the military now calls a linear aerospike engine, except the entire back of the aircraft is just one big linear aerospike engine. But basically, the idea is that if you're transitioning from one propulsion system to the other, you're going to leave kind of an odd-looking contrail in the sky. And what does it look like? It looks like puffs of smoke rings around another contrail, or the donuts on a rope contrail that has been reported around Texas and other places early in the morning or late in the evening. And it's generally that point where the internal engines are propelling it up to speed, and then the outside burning mechanism was pulsing, and it would leave a little burst of, like a smoke ring at intervals. Now, I've seen this thing actually fly over the area where I live in Northern California, in Redding, and I begin to wonder, you know, if, according to the eyewitnesses that I spoke to, who've actually been close enough to touch this thing, and it's very difficult to see from this drawing here, but right up near the nose of this aircraft are two large, what appear to be mirrored balls, like the lawn ornaments they have in the northeastern United States. Don't ask me why they put these things out there, but they look very much like an infrared seeker head, which is it's a cryogenically cooled sensing device, except in the instance of these things, they have two of them. And each of those infrared sensors can actually see an infrared image, just like you can see with your eyes, except that this sees an infrared. Now, the different witnesses that I've spoken to have told me this particular aircraft is probably one of the largest remotely piloted vehicles ever built, and there were probably as many as 18 to 20 of these built, from what I've been told. And the interesting thing about this is that this was all done on the QT. This wasn't ever discussed, as far as I know, with the Soviets when they were talking about their strategic arm limitation talks between Reagan and Gorbachev and this kind of thing. In fact, if you go back to the meetings that they had in Reykjavik in 1986, and you look at the film of those time frames, when Reagan shows up, he has this expression of apprehension and maybe a little bit of fear. And Gorbachev looks absolutely incensed as he's climbing out of his limousine to go into the talks. And after 2 days of these talks, they come back out, and the expressions are reversed. It's now Reagan who has a totally different demeanor, actually one of maybe relief and joy. We've reached an agreement. And it's now Gorbachev who has the look and the expression of fear and apprehension. What's my information? That this thing was in deployment from at least 1982 to 83 and was flying over the Soviet Union completely unscathed and untouched in 1986, about the time that Gorbachev and these people got together. Well, the story goes that during this meeting, Reagan actually sort of lifted the edge of the tent up and let the camel stick its nose under there to see what we really have, or at least discuss some of what we have. And it was so appalling to Gorbachev when he found out exactly how much further advanced we were than the Soviet Union. I think he finally decided that it was economically in the best interest of the Soviet Union to begin declaring policies of glasnost and perestroika, and they probably even promised him that he'd get a Nobel Peace Prize out of it, which, of course, he did. So it makes you wonder. It makes you wonder, what are all the things going on behind the scenes? Now, let's see here. November 12th, 1988. I had, at that time, recently become reacquainted with a friend of mine from college, from Art Center, and we found that we had a lot of common interests, one of which was advanced technology aircraft. On November 12th of 1988, there was going to be an air show held out of Norton Air Force Base in San Bernardino. It's now decommissioned from what I understand. But this base had a number of defense contractors that were housed right on the base. I think TRW, Ford Aerospace, there were several other companies, Lockheed. They all had facilities on this base, and they did a lot of analysis and testing and things of this nature. Now, several sources since then, Philip Corso in his book The Day After Roswell and some other places, have all confirmed that there were things going on in Norton Air Force Base that were really kind of outside the normal purview of experimentation and research that you would expect at other places like Edwards Air Force Base, even though later on we find that Edwards Air Force Base was up to its eyebrows in this kind of thing too. But this friend of mine and I knew about this air show that was going to be happening in Norton Air Force Base, so we decided that we were going to rendezvous out there and you know, see the SR-71, maybe do a flyby and some other aircraft. And a week later, I was unable to attend because a friend of mine had called me up and asked me to do some artwork for a magazine, and it had to be done over the weekend, so I was unable to attend. But the following week, I contacted my friend. We'll just call him Brad for the sake of this discussion. I called up Brad, and Brad seemed, there was something wrong. I just couldn't tell what it was, and I said, well, what's going on, Brad? I mean, you don't sound like you're real excited about the air show, and I mean, did you see something interesting? And he says, well, he says, actually, he says, I think I saw some things I wasn't supposed to see. And I said, well, how is that possible? Anything that they put out on the flight line or in the hangars is for public display. He says, well, that's not what I'm talking about. He said, one of the fellows that I went to this air show with was a fellow who used to be involved with the Pentagon. So, one of the undersecretaries of defense in some department there. But the fellow was retired, multimillionaire, very wealthy, and he was one of Brad's clients. And Brad was a designer. And his intent was to put me together with this gentleman, and maybe we could network some some jobs. So, right in the middle of the air show, right about the time that, let's see, right about the time that the, excuse me for just a second here. Right about the time that this air show, and this is an article about the air show on that particular date, was supposed to begin with the Thunderbirds flying their flying demonstration display for the public. This gentleman turns to my friend and says, follow me. And they go over to a big hangar at the west end of the field, and they're met there by some security personnel who suggest that you know, they need to show some ID, and this fellow that my friend was with passed him off as his personal aide. And so in they went. They get on the Air Force version of a 727, I think it was, and they fly up to Plant 42 in Palmdale, where Lockheed Skunk Works is. And they walk into the Skunk Works building. This is Norton Air Force Base. This is the hangar. This is, of course, many of the buildings that would have been in the foreground have since been demolished, but this is the large hangar that they walked into initially. This is the Lockheed Skunk Works as it appears today. This is a view of the facility from, I would say that looks like it's from the southern face of the facility. It's easily 500,000 to 750,000 square feet inside the hangar. It's a huge hangar. And you can kind of tell by the size of the doors there below just to the right of where the Lockheed Martin logo is. But so they were flowing up to this hangar, and as soon as they walked into the hangar, this gentleman turns to Brad and says, there are some things in here that you're not supposed to see, that I wasn't told were going to be part of this show. And so just keep your mouth shut. We'll leave. We'll be out of here just as soon as we can, but just don't talk to anybody. Well, in the course of the show, sitting there in the hangar is that first generation Aurora, the one that's shaped like a flattened out football shape. And sure enough, the tiles on the tail end of it are all severely eroded, discolored from the heat. One of the things that Brad finds when he walks into this thing is that it has 121 circular ports in the tiles on the bottom of the aircraft. And it turns out that there's a lieutenant colonel just a few feet away talking to some female members of Congress or the Senate, some different political people who had security classifications for these kinds of things. And he's explaining how each one of these circular tiles represents a vertical launch tube, each one of which carries a fully armed nuclear reentry vehicle, a single cone-shaped MIRV. Except that this aircraft carries 121 of them, all packed into this nice little honeycomb type arrangement in the belly of the aircraft. So you can imagine if there's 18 or 20 of these aircraft and each one of them have 121 nuclear reentry vehicles or the capability of carrying that much, it represents an entirely different strategic threat to the rest of the world. I mean, it's great for us, but in a way it makes you wonder, what are the Soviets being told? I mean, are they really being informed about this behind our backs? The public and the the U.S. citizenry doesn't even know about this stuff, but they're talking about it with Gorbachev. It just doesn't seem right to me. Anyhow, in the course of this display at Lockheed Skunk Works, there are a number of other aircraft, one of which is the losing prototype in the B-2 stealth bomber competition. And this thing was the funkiest looking aircraft you can imagine. It looked a little bit like the aircraft that was shown in the Honda commercial about we have our own black projects for the release of the, I think it was the Honda CRX, little hatchback. But this particular aircraft, as it's been explained to me, was like a flying wing, except that it had a boom that extended out from the tail a considerable distance, and it had a little V-shaped tail on the bottom of it. And the back end of this boom would articulate and turn just like the tail of a real bird when it's, changing its direction of flight. Very interesting, but wasn't something that the Department of the Air Force thought very highly of. And so ultimately Northrop wound up getting the B-2 bomber contract. Now, the other part of this story is that a little while later, they part this curtain, and here are 3 flying saucers in this hangar at Skunk Works. And they're each hovering off the floor, several feet above the floor. No landing gear underneath, no cables supporting them from above. They're just sort of floating. You can see them sort of moving around, almost like they're floating on the water, like a ship at the harbor. And he said that there were 3 different sizes. There was the smallest one was, his original estimate was about 16 feet. Now, let's see. This was Brad's first marker drawing of what he saw. This represents the smallest of the 3, which I eventually determined using basic drafting techniques that the actual diagram, or the actual diameter at the base of this structure, this vehicle, was about 24 feet in diameter. And the reason I can tell that is because he was sure that the crew compartment, the sphere that's in the middle, was 12 feet in diameter. And if you think about sticking 4 ejection seats, in the upper half of that sphere, and having enough room to move around inside there, it starts to come together. He knew that the sides were sloped at about 35 degrees, so if you take a 12-foot diameter sphere, about a 2.5-inch or 2.5-foot wide ledge on the flanks of the sphere, and then the slope, you bring it out, it works out to 24 feet in diameter. And using other techniques to map out what the circumference and what the width degree-wise of each of these sections, these stacks of plates in the bottom, which are referred to as capacitors. I eventually came up with this drawing. Now, it wasn't until later that I put in the call-outs that explain what each of these things are, what the different components are in this system. But I made a blueprint of this drawing, and I sent it to my friend Brad. And then I called him up a couple of days on the phone. I said, "Did you get the blueprint?" He says, "Yes, I did." He says, "Mark, I'm only going to tell you this once. This has got to be the most dangerous illustration you've ever done, because this exactly matches what I saw. This is every aspect of it, the size, the shape, the relative position of the components, everything. That's the way it looked." And he says, "If you're smart, you'll tear this thing up and throw it away, and you'll never talk about it again, because you're going to be in big trouble if you go public with this." And he was right. I had all kinds of problems. But I didn't really go public with it until years later, when I started getting confirmation of this system from other sources. I became aware of this propulsion technology, and it was referred to as the alien reproduction vehicle. So the first thing you think, of course, is that it's a back-engineered system, that it's designed and built, it's based on something that we recovered in a crash, say Roswell or something like that. And so, with the electronics background that I had from the Air Force, the school that I went to, the engineering that I saw when I was working for different defense contractors, I began asking questions. I'd go to work for Allied Signal, and we'd be talking about the space shuttle and some engineering, and I'd say, well, what do you know about advanced capacitors and lifting things with capacitors? And this one fellow, Roger Turner, was an engineer there, and he says, well, yeah, you can do that. It's called the Biefeld-Brown effect. There were these two scientists, and they found that if you put a lot of voltage at a high frequency on some parallel plate capacitors with a nice, like a glass or a nice plastic or silicon dielectric, that's the stuff in between the plates, the conductors. If you put an electrical charge on those plates, that it'll levitate. And so then we began looking at this and began to realize that if you can control the amount of current that goes to each one of those sections, that you can basically control how much current there is on one side of it. You can make it turn and bank, just like a helicopter, like the swash plate that controls the amount of cutting into the air that a helicopter has when it's banking and turning. But you do it all electronically. Well, I said, well, how do you know this really works? I mean, isn't it just some science fiction thing? He says, oh, no. He says, I had a buddy who went to school. He was a metallurgy student at University of Arizona in Tucson. His name was Mark Stambo, I believe it was. And he decided that he was going to try something like this. He'd heard about the Biefeld-Brown effect, and he went out and he got some sheets of glass, and he put some copper plates in between them, and glass, copper, and then he sealed the edges, and he had a wire going into each plate from opposite sides. He ran them to a power supply, high voltage, low amps, high frequency, kind of a spiked sawtooth wave, as they would call it. And the thing actually floated, and everybody was startled by this. Everybody in the whole metallurgy department heard about it. Before you knew it, news began to spread like wildfire. Well, it was only 2 days later. Some guys in suits show up at the college. And they call all these students into kind of an assembly, and they say, basically, this is classified. You will not talk about it. If you do, you will be prosecuted. End of story. Don't talk about it. And I don't know that it happened, but I'm sure that there's a good possibility that they were asked to sign some kind of non-disclosure agreement as well. Now this was probably, the story I heard was in the late 1980s, early 1990s, after I began to research this kind of thing. And so going back a number of years, sort of backtracking time-wise, I'm figuring that this story involving the fellow at the University of Arizona in Tucson probably occurred somewhere in the mid-1980s. Now, the more I begin to investigate this, your imagination starts, well, where can I see one? Where can I go and watch? And so I began doing just that. I would go and I would hang out in the mountains that kind of overlooked the Edwards Dry Lake area. I would go up to Wrightwood and I would find a location just beyond the ski resort where you could go out to this sort of a prominence, and you could sit there and you could watch the whole high desert basin with binoculars on a clear night and see every bit of it. And you could see stuff. You could see things that would light up, zip across the sky, stop, and then go out. Or you'd see things that would do this, brightly illuminated, like a meteor. And for all intents and purposes, if you were uneducated about what meteors really look like, you would think, oh, I was a meteor, no big deal. But then if you can get it on film, some of which I did, you begin to realize that these aren't meteors at all. This is actually the manifestation of some kind of advanced propulsion system that uses extremely high voltages of electricity. And what happens is that when you put a tremendous amount of electricity on a system like this, it begins to charge the air around the vehicle. It actually begins to ionize the air. Basically, an ion is just an atom that has an extra amount of electrical charge to it. And so its polarity becomes fixed according to the atom, what kind of material it is, that sort of thing, nitrogen, oxygen. But anyway, ions will glow because when they stabilize, when the charge is dissipated, it's given off as a photon. So you see it. It'll glow. It'll illuminate. And so when these things fire up the power and they create this bright, intense point of light. And I've seen everything from a deep bluish green all the way up to something that was so intensely white with kind of a blue halo around it. It was like looking at an arc welder's cherry as he's busy welding steel together. The funny thing about it, though, is that even though it was seemingly that bright, it didn't hurt your eyes to look at it. I mean, it hurt even less than to look at this light that they've got pointed at me right now. So you have to understand that there's something going on there that involves extremely powerful energy. And so one of the things that occurred to me was that if you have an energy source that can perform these kinds of capabilities, do these kinds of things, make these unusual terms, accelerate at blinding speed, there has to be other things going on that are really sort of beyond what we think of in terms of normal physics. And I was just absolutely driven by my curiosity to try and figure out what made these things go. And so every chance I got, I would talk to people about this stuff. And one of the things that I decided I would do is that, you know, I'd heard all of these fantastic stories about people who thought they'd been abducted by aliens. And I was as skeptical as anybody you can imagine. I mean, oh, little green men come and take you away in the middle of the night, yeah. Okay, great. But part of me said, if there's even just a sliver of truth in any of those stories, even just a little bit, there might be a chance that if these people really were taken aboard some of these craft, that they saw something. They might have seen just a small part of some propulsion system. Might be able to, and the thing about engineering is if you understand what a Tesla coil looks like, or if you understand what capacitor plates buried in silicone look like, or if you see an oxygen tank, you can generally tell what things are because of the way they're shaped, or how long they are, or what relative positions of things. And so at this point, I became aware of a radio program. It was about 1989. It was a program broadcast over most of the southern United States from Las Vegas. It was called The Billy Goodman Happening with Billy Goodman. And he was kind of the forerunner of Art Bell and Coast to Coast. And he would talk about UFOs and secret projects and, you know, the hidden government and, you know, alien abductions and things like this. And so one night I'm listening, and here are these young ladies being interviewed, and they're talking about their different abduction experiences. And so I thought, well, hey, maybe I can get in touch with these young ladies and, you know, establish a correspondence and see if there's anything to their story. And so I managed to arrange meetings with 3 of these young ladies. And the first young lady I met she didn't really have anything in the way of propulsion technology to share with me, but what she said was that when she was a little girl in the 1970s, that her father had been the head of the FAA in Alabama, and that she, for a long time, had wanted to be a ballerina and a dancer, and she was taking dance lessons and things and doing recitals. And as a young lady, she and her mom were on their way to a dance recital one evening. It was about 7:30 in the evening. The sun was setting off to the right. Some telephone poles and some houses. They were coming up on an intersection, you know, cars in every direction with a stop sign. And out of the blue, here comes this flying saucer shaped like the planet Saturn, glowing around the rim, just shaped pretty much like the planet Saturn, more of a flattened out center section, kind of like a sunny side up egg. And from this vehicle came these brilliant beams of light. And in an instant, all of the adults, her mom sitting next to her in the car, all of the adults in the other vehicles slumped, fell asleep. But she was still wide awake. And one of the beams of light comes over and right on the car and instantly renders the sheet metal, glass, everything on that side of the car transparent. And out of the blue come these 3 little entities that looked like, she said they looked just like Casper the Friendly Ghost, except that they had big black eyes, and they were floating over the ground. They came over and they reached right in through the sheet metal of the car, like it was Jell-O, and pulled her, kicking and screaming, right out of her seatbelt, right out of the car, and took her away into this vehicle. And then she describes a number of procedures that they did, but she said that one of the things that they had done was they had initiated an implant. And I asked her to describe it, and forgive me, I know this will be a little graphic, but she said that she was laid out on a table that felt soft like a regular mattress, except that it was made out of metal. It was shiny and, you know, looked just like stainless steel, except that it was soft and pliable. Under her neck was a cradle that supported her head, and her head was tilted back, and there was a band across her forehead that was securing her head in place. And below that, from the lower part of the saddle, came a device that came up and hooked into the lower part of her jaw and held her mouth open. The entities, the typical grays, were wearing these full-length smocks, almost like a burqa, except it was transparent, with an optically clear band of glass or plexiglass around the large eyes, little flat on the top, basically dropping straight down to the floor, with some little arms that they could reach out and they could use their arms and so forth. They're all standing around the table watching. And this large mechanized object rolls up to the table, extends an arm out over the table, basically right in front of her face, with these two objects that look like giant knitting needles. And without further ado, these two knitting needle type devices, each of which had what looked like a little BB on the end of it, were driven right through the roof of her mouth with no anesthetic whatsoever. And she said, the last thing I saw was my blood spraying on this device as I screamed and passed out. And so I'm sitting there having this discussion with her in a Denny's restaurant. And I said, well, if that really happened, you certainly must have some kind of scar in the roof of your mouth. And she said, oh, yes, I do. And I said, well, I know this is really personal, but would you mind if I looked? And she said, you got a flashlight? So we went out to the parking lot. I got one out of my car. Oh, boy. There were these two deep red penetration scars, each of which was about 3/16 of an inch in diameter. Either one of them offset from the center line of the roof of her mouth by maybe 1/4 of an inch. So they were basically 1/4 of an inch apart. And the scars were right at where the hard palate in the roof of your mouth ends and the soft fleshy part begins back where the epiglottis or the uvula hangs down. But that's where they were. And I said, oh my God, up till now I thought this was all baloney. This is amazing. So what else happened? Well, so we went into some of the other adventures or misadventures that had occurred in her life, but she said that one of the things that she'd noticed was that whenever they used their technology to subdue humans, that these entities would all wear a helmet. It looked like white plastic. And it wrapped around the cranium. It had two panels that came down on the side with a slit up the middle, and then a nose piece, and then two openings for their eyes, which is exactly the description of an Etruscan helmet from ancient Greece, or ancient Rome, in that area. And so I began to wonder, is it possible that the ancient Romans knew about these entities? And this is the inspiration for the design of their helmets. I mean, this is such an obvious correlation to me. It was fascinating. So then I went on to the next young lady that Billy Goodman interviewed. And this young lady had an implant in her ear that you could see behind her eardrum. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but your eardrum is actually like a piece of cellophane. If you get it wet, or if you use some water or some glycerin, it almost becomes transparent like a piece of glass. And so she put some water in her ear and dry it out, and then she had a professional otoscope ready to show me. And she let me look in her normal ear, which, you see a normal eardrum with the little blood vessels going through it and everything, and the little hairs in the ear canal and the little globs of wax and stuff. But in the ear that had the implant was a device that looked like a fat metallic horseshoe that wrapped around the tympanic bones that go between the eardrum and the inner ear. And she told me that these entities would communicate to her while she was asleep. They would talk to her while she was in sort of a semi-conscious state, and she could hear these voices, and they would tell her things. And so, and this is where it starts to get a little startling and scary, but at one point, she claims that the military showed up in the middle of the night, kicked in her kitchen door, and loaded her onto a gurney after spraying her in the face with an aerosol that knocked her out instantly. Took her in a helicopter into the high desert. She remembers awakening in the middle of the transport, flying over the high desert at 2 in the morning, full moon, so she could see things. And hovering next to the helicopter is a black flying saucer. Now remember the part about being black. I'll tell you more about that later. So, in the process of going to some facility in the high desert, she's interrogated by people who appear to be human. And severely beaten. I saw her several days later. She had a big bruise of a hand mark on her throat like this. She had abrasions in her mouth and down the back of her throat as though she'd gone through some kind of extensive examination. And she remembers hearing two military officials saying that they really wanted to get this thing out of her ear and investigate it, but they were afraid that if they took it out, it would kill her. But in the process of beating her up, they actually damaged the device so badly that the aliens or whoever they were could no longer communicate with her. So they came back perhaps 8 months later, and they replaced not only the damaged one, but they put in a new one on the other side. And I came over and I took the otoscope and I looked in her again, and on the side that had been fixed, there were 3 spiral scars that went from the opening of the ear canal right up to the eardrum, like someone had literally screwed a mandrel into the ear canal to guide a precision surgical instrument to take out the damaged unit and put in a new one. On the other side, it looked like they just dropped it in. I mean, there weren't any scars, nothing, but you could see this dark, reflective, metallic mass behind her eardrum. It was absolutely amazing. And the other thing was that it looked, in both cases, as though these new devices had completely replaced the tympanic bones, that there was no longer a connection between the eardrum and the inner ear. It was just this thing looked, it's about the size and shape of the little battery you put in an electric watch. Well, in the process of talking to this young lady, I asked her if she'd ever seen any propulsion system components, and she described an incident where she had been aboard one of these craft and she'd been fully conscious and they seemed to trust her. And she described seeing a central column with a flywheel-like device, similar to the one shown in the drawing, that was spinning. The column was spinning in one direction, the flywheel was spinning in the opposite direction. And the column itself was this transparent glass-like substance, and the fluid inside it was a shimmering, silvery, dark material, almost like mercury with some carbon-60 mixed into it, which under certain conditions is like a superconductor. So began collecting all this data, all this information, and in talking to the young lady, I said, well, you know, I would really like to come over and be there when they show up. Do you know when they will be there? Now, this was a big leap for me because I'd been really skeptical up to this point. But I was really hoping that I could convince these little guys from wherever they were that maybe they might show me some of their stuff. I know, it sounds silly, but I was really hoping. So she said that these devices in her ear would go off, usually a day and a half, 24 hours or so before they would actually show up. And they would always show up on either the 11th or the 22nd of the month. Those were their 2 favorite days. And so on December 11th, 1989, or at least 24 hours before that, she called me up and she said, it's Miller time, which was our code for they're going to be here tomorrow night. So I should explain that the reason that we came up with a code was because she had a friend in the phone company who'd come out and had verified unequivocally that her phone was tapped, and that in fact she was harassed so often by helicopters that would buzz her house and buzz her car in traffic that it was quite phenomenal. She had over 400 photographs of these helicopters buzzing her car, which was pretty amazing any way you cut it. So I got my camera and I got some infrared film and I had a magnetic sensor and, binoculars and a flashlight, and, I was ready for anything, I thought. And we sat up all night drinking coffee, and me drinking Pepsi because I like my caffeine cold, and staying up until the wee hours of the morning talking about all this stuff. And she had shared with me at some point that there had been several occasions when these little orbs, these luminous balls of light, would come floating through the house, and they would pass right through the wall. And in this one occasion, recent occasion, one had passed right out through the screen door of the house, with the main door to the house open. And so I said, well, now, if this uses some kind of advanced technology that involves high voltages and ionization, maybe, just maybe, there's some residue. Maybe there's something we can see here. So I went out and I got my flashlight out of the car and I went over to the screen and I shined the flashlight at a shallow angle across the surface of the screen, approximately in the area of the screen where she said this thing had gone through it. And sure enough, I mean, if you ever looked closely at your screen doors, you'll see that there's a lot of little fuzz and lint and little tiny hairs and stuff if you've got pets and so forth that cling to the screen. There's almost like a static charge there. But in this one spot, there was this perfect little circle where there was absolutely nothing. Just in that one spot where this thing had passed through it. So to me, that, I mean, she never would have thought of this in terms of a way of faking, you know, the evidence, so to speak. So to me, that was some credible testimony as to what was going to happen. So I go over to her house the night that this is supposed to happen. We stay up all night. Nothing happens. She and her roommate go to bed. I'm crashing on the couch. I got my camera at the ready. I got my watch. I'm, you know, making sure I'm taking notes on everything. And I'm laying there, and all of a sudden, every dog in the neighborhood goes absolutely nuts, screeching and howling. I mean, these animals sounded like they were actually being physically harmed. And this went on. I'm looking at my watch, and I'm thinking, well, I don't see any lights. I don't see any, you know, spotlights out in the yard. I don't hear any weird sounds other than the dogs just going crazy. Even her dog down in the basement, where it would be fairly isolated from the sound of, say, a passing siren that might make a dog, you know, howl or something. So this lasts for exactly 1 minute and 30 seconds and stops as though somebody turned off a recording. And I thought, well, that was strange. I wonder if the young lady and her roommate in the bedroom heard that. And I could hear what sounded like a conversation in the bedroom. So I thought, well, you know, I'd had so much Pepsi to drink, my bladder was killing me. So I was going to get up and go use the restroom, which was just down the hall past their bedroom. And I'm laying there like this, I'm looking at my watch, and okay, so I'm like, and I can't move. It's like I'm actually frozen in a block of ice. I cannot move, and I can't even seem to summon the will to make myself. It was like I'm absolutely frozen in this position. It was the strangest, most vulnerable feeling you can imagine, to not be able to move, to be fully awake. I mean, this wasn't a night terror, this wasn't a nightmare. I was wide awake, looking at my watch. It was 10 minutes to 7, you know, the morning of the 12th, actually. And so I, you know, when you're really, really scared, sometimes you'll call on the Lord or Jehovah or whoever you worship. And in my case, I just said, Jesus, help me. I got to get out of this. I don't know what this is. Please save me. You know, I was terrified because I hadn't expected this. I thought, you know, they'd show up and they'd, you know, tell me about their stuff, and it wasn't like that at all. So I'm laying there like this, and I thought, I have to focus, I have to focus, I have to focus. And I thought to myself, I'm going to take in a deep breath, and then I'm just going to throw myself off the couch. And I took in the deep breath, and I began to initiate the roll, and I was almost to the edge. And all of a sudden, there was this sound in the middle of my head. And you know, for those of you who crack your knuckles from time to time, you may understand this. But if you take your fist and you clench it and you press it against your forehead and crack your knuckles, the sound that you'll hear, the conduction of that sound through your skull, is exactly, that's kind of a simulation of exactly what I experienced. It was a snapping sound right in the middle of my skull, and I was out cold just like that, from being wide awake out. Never saw anything. Never saw anybody walk up to the sofa. Nothing. And so, almost immediately, I'm awake again. I look down at my watch. Only a minute has passed. Everything seemed normal. I could see the VCR. I can see the clock on the TV. I can see all these different things. I could see my watch. It's now something on the order of 8 minutes before 7 on that morning. But now, I cannot even summon the will to try and move. I mean, I can't even think of it. My bladder's killing me. I gotta go. But I cannot, for the life of me, get up. And I could still hear this conversation going on in the back room. And I'm thinking, well, if they're talking, why don't they come out and see what's happening to me? You know, if they heard this, what's going on? Well, this lasted for exactly an hour. And at 10 minutes to 8 o'clock, 1 hour later, every dog in the neighborhood went absolutely nuts again. Started screeching and howling. And as soon as it stopped, 1 minute and 30 seconds later, like a recording had been turned off, suddenly I could move. And within a minute or so, the young lady comes out of her room and she says, look at all the clocks, look at all the clocks. And I said, well, 10 minutes to 8. What about it? She said, that's not the real time. And I said, well, how do you know? She says, and I don't know how she knew, but she says, we know. Nobody had touched my watch. And it was the kind of watch that you need to know how to adjust little things on it to make it change the time. But it was actually 10 minutes to 9 o'clock. We'd missed a whole hour somewhere in that time. So a couple of days later, I asked her if she could explain to me what had happened. And she says, well, you remember when the dog started screeching at 10 minutes to 7? I said, yes. She says, well, as that happened, she says, I looked over to the east side of my bedroom, and the entire wall, furniture and everything, sucked back into what looked like a tunnel, like a black hole, like a wormhole. And out of the darkness of that wormhole come two grays. And they just walk right up, stand, eyes forward. Mentally, they summon her to come out of bed, get out of bed, come over. And she's trying to wake up her roommate and say, wake up, wake up, wake up. She can't wake her up, no matter what. So she goes over and she stands in front of these two. And she says, the minute you make eye contact with them, your conscious life is somewhere else. You see and think and understand and visualize everything that they put into your mind right through line of sight contact through the eyes. And she says, and if you want to be able to prevent them from controlling you, she says, never make eye contact. Always look at the floor. And I thought that was kind of interesting. But this is what she told me, and this is the scary part. She said that sometime in the next few years, now this was 1989, now there's a record of this, it's written down, what she said, they told her. She said, a few years from now, there will be a terrible incident, and she says, what I saw were some really tall skyscrapers with smoke coming off the skyscrapers. And then, she said, the skyscrapers collapsed, and there was this huge cloud. And she said, I couldn't tell whether it was an earthquake or what, but she said, it was a terrible, lots of people died, and it was awful. He says, then they told me that the next thing that was going to happen was going to be this terrible tsunami somewhere in the southwestern Pacific. And it was going to radiate out all over the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean. Hundreds of thousands of people would be killed. Now, both of those things have happened, 9/11 and the tsunami of December 26, 2004, I think it was. Now, she said that the third thing that was going to happen before they came in a mass landing to Earth in the high desert near Mojave, of all places, she said that there would be a tremendous earthquake near the Salton Sea along some part of the San Andreas or some tributary fault of the San Andreas Fault, but she said it would be a 9.0 earthquake. Now, up until the point of the tsunami, no one had ever even heard, very often anyway, of a 9.0 earthquake anywhere. And yet, the tsunami that occurred near Indonesia was 9.0 on the seafloor. Now, she says that she was confused about the last image because she wasn't sure whether it was actually an earthquake or whether it was a meteor impact. But she says in either instance, she says the result of that was that Los Angeles would be leveled and millions of people would die. Now, if you look at the timing of all of this, and this all sounds kind of spooky and mysterious, but the first incident, 2001. The next incident, 2004. Which means that theoretically we're already overdue for the third incident. But she said that the fourth incident would happen beyond that, and that it would involve this mass landing. Now, if sometime in the next 2 months we have a major earthquake down here, then the interval appears to be 4 years, or approximately 4 years, which would put us right at December 21st, 2012 for a possible arrival, which I thought was kind of an interesting coincidence. Anyway, so in beginning to realize that these people who've had the abduction phenomena have actually seen things and have described components that match what I know from several witnesses actually exist, it begins to suggest that these aren't just wild tales that people are dreaming up. These are things that are really happening, things that you can substantiate by checking the facts, by looking at what's happening, by looking at the things that they describe. Now, there have been lots of other incidences. In 1993, I was going to the post office in Rialto, and I came across a pickup truck that had a B-2 bomber production facility sticker on one corner of the bumper, and the other corner had a picture of a flying saucer that says, "They're here." So I waited, and the fellow came out, and I said, "Are they really?" And he says, "Yes, but I really can't tell you about it." And I said, "Well, let me tell you what I know." So I told him some of these stories and tried to encourage him. And this is something that any of you can do, is if you see someone you think has seen something, or you know someone you think has seen something, to try and encourage them to be open and talk about it, because this is the best way you can find for developing leads. I found more leads just engaging people in conversation about things that they feel reluctant to talk about because most people will ridicule and make fun of them. But this fellow turns to me and he says, I work at the Northrop B-2 Palmer production facility, and he says, since they passed this new law that you cannot smoke inside a federal facility, he says they've put up some picnic benches outside and we have to go outside on a smoke break every couple hours if we want a cigarette. So he said, as you probably know, the Northrop facility is right at the opposite end of the Plant 42 complex from Lockheed Skunk Works. And so here we are in the middle of summer in 1992. He says, I work the graveyard shift, and it's about 1:45. And he says, all of the lights around the complex are extinguished. And we see the sheriff's deputies come up and they block off all the surrounding streets. And we know that when that happens, it means that there's a classified aircraft of one kind or another that's going to come in and land at the complex. Now, I got a ticket in that area not too long ago, well, a few years after that. And so I had occasion to talk to one of the sheriff's deputies. And I said, do you guys really do that? Do you really block off the... Yes, we do. And do you see stuff like what I'm about to tell you? And he said, yes, they do. Well, what he tells me is that they noticed that the big bypass doors on the eastern face of the Lockheed Skunk Works complex, the building, this huge hangar that I showed you the photograph earlier, that they're wide open and there are just a few lights on inside, it's just a dull glow. But they can see all of these strange little, they look like these little, it's a little self-propelled platform that the linemen use to work on electrical power lines. And it's like a little tractor with wheels, and it has an arm that comes up with a basket on the end of it. And the guy can stand in the basket with these little controls, and he can move the arm all around so he can work on the power lines. But they've got like a dozen of these things in a circle, sitting outside of the Lockheed Skunk Works. And hanging from each one of these baskets, which are up in the air like this, is this tarp, this one continuous tarp that goes from one basket to the next, to the next, to the next, makes a big, like a cylinder that stretches all the way to the ground. He says, we're sitting there trying to figure out, what the heck are they doing down there? And then he realized that because it was the summertime and because the smog was blowing up into the high desert, and you probably know this because you live in this area, that at night, when there's a lot of light pollution from the local city lights, street lights, the smog tends to glow a dull orange. And it kind of illuminates the whole sky. And he said that silhouetted against this orange sky was this big, black, lens-shaped flying saucer hovering about 500 feet above this cluster of vehicles. Now, this is where I make the connection between the black saucer that I mentioned earlier. So here's this flying saucer hovering above this group of vehicles. And out of the midst of this group of vehicles comes a man with a large handheld spotlight, kind of a blue-green spotlight. And he flashes it at this vehicle 3 times. As it silently hovers there. No jet noise, no fluttering of the tarp or anything. This object has 3 lights on the bottom and it flashes those lights 3 times and then it slowly descends into this cluster of vehicles. The arms all extend out into the center of this thing, and then the entire group of vehicles as one unit trundles into the hangar. The doors close, all the lights on the facility come on, the sheriff's deputies leave. So he said, I smoked a lot of cigarettes after that. And he said, my persistence was rewarded about a week later when the process reversed itself. The sheriffs show up, they block off the streets, the hangar doors open, this bundle of vehicles comes trundling out. The arms come up like this. A man comes out of the midst with a big flash spotlight. And after about 15 minutes, this object slowly rises out of the midst of these vehicles to about 500 feet. And he said, the fellow on the ground flashes it 3 times. The object in the sky flashes 3 times. And he says, then this thing went from the far end of Plant 42, past me and disappeared in the dark in less than a second and a half, just like that, silently. No sonic boom, no jet noise, nothing. And he says, then I knew. He says, then I absolutely knew that we had captured whatever that bizarre other half of the physics is that we don't know anything about. Somebody figured it out. And so this was the kind of information that began coming to me, and the more people that I talked to, the more people I asked, the more stories that I came across. The same young lady who I spent the night at her house who had this strange incident, she had this ability to engage people in conversation as well, and would ask, people that she was talking to, what do you do? Have you ever seen a UFO? And sometimes people say, well, yes, as a matter of fact, I have. So she's at a billiards hall one day with her roommate, shooting pool, and this young lady in an Air Force uniform comes up and says, hey, can I shoot a couple of rounds with you? And they said, sure. So they started talking, and they said, what do you do? Oh, I work out at Edwards Air Force Base, and my husband works at that secret place, North Base, out there north of the Muroc Dry Lake bed. Well, that's interesting. And she says, well, what do you guys do? And she says, well, basically we just see UFOs. And she said, well, you mean like really UFOs, or just you're involved in science fiction or what? And she says, no, alien abduction, the whole thing, and basically has ruined her employment ability, her ability to be employed, because over the years, these kind of incidents can actually culminate in post-traumatic stress and all kinds of things like that, which manifest in this particular young lady. But so this young lady in the uniform says, well, I've actually seen one. Oh, really? Where? At Edwards North Base. Well, how? How, do you have a special clearance? How did you do that? She says, well, and this is the weakness that we have throughout the security of our national defense, is that, often we enlist these 18, 19, 20-year-old kids who can't appreciate, the true profound nature of national security and what it really means. But the story was that this young lady, her husband was employed working as a security detail over at North Base. And one Christmas, his car had broken down, and so she had to drive him to and from work from where they lived on the base. And so he calls her up before his shift is over in the wee hours of the morning and says, honey, why don't you come over a little early? I got a few things I'd like to show you, before anybody else gets here to relieve me. So she goes over and she shows up early, and he's the only one there because it's Christmas. Nobody's around. So in they go, and she goes down the line and she sees all these secret aircraft, but the coup de grace was one of these, sitting in one of the hangars. So it's around 1993. It's the first public unveiling of the stealth bomber at Edwards Air Force Base. They've got it backed into a hangar so you can't walk around, and they've got this big blue curtain behind it. In fact, I think there's even a photograph in here somewhere of that actual presentation. It's right back in the beginning, wouldn't you know it? Sorry about the delay here. Anyway, so I'm at this exhibit. There we go. That's it, right there. That's what it looked like at Edwards Air Force Base. That's as close as you get to it at that time. And so I'm walking around the base, and I rendezvous with some of my defense contractor buddies, and they introduced me to this fellow standing in one of the big hangars near one of these exhibits, and there's all these they're just black boxes. Nothing really exciting about the displays, just kind of standing over the corner, twiddling some, looked bored. I felt sorry for the guy, so I struck up a conversation with him. And in our discussions, we find out that we were both in the Air Force at about the same time, 1973, 1974, in that time frame. And I talked about what I'd worked on, and he said that he'd been a crew chief, working on aircraft that were being flight tested at Edwards Air Force Base at that time. And I said, really? He says, what do you do? And I said, well, I'm an artist, and I've done work that's been in Aviation Week and Space Technology Magazine and stuff like this. He said, oh, well, do you know Bill Scott, the editor? And I said, yeah. He said, well, he's a friend of mine. He says, I was a crew chief on one of Bill Scott's planes when he was a flight test pilot at Edwards Air Force Base. So all these connections start to be made between different people. And I said, well, that must have been really exciting that day and age, because I remember some of the aircraft that were being flight tested in those times, because we were all really excited about the possibility of maybe getting to work on them someday instead of these old 1950s fighter planes like I worked on. But I said, I heard some interesting stories about the Persian Gulf War, I talked to a young lady whose husband was a Marine stationed on a ship over in the Gulf during the war, and he was talking about all these balls of light that were zipping around the sky over the battlefield. And they would make right-angle turns at incredible velocities and stop on a dime, accelerate like they'd been shot out of a cannon. And he says, yeah, that's right. And I said, what? He says, that's true. And I said, you know about this? He says, yes, I do. And I said, well, if you know about that, then, you know, this young lady not too long ago told me a story about a disc over at North Base. And he said, yeah, that's true. What? You know about the disc at North Base? He said, yeah, I've seen it. You saw it? When? 1973. So think about it. I mean, that's 20 years ago, before the 1993 discussion I'm having with this guy. In 1973, he saw one of, the thing I had up there before, that's what he saw. And so he described it for me, you know, flat on the bottom, sloping sides, a little edge, the thing on the top, the little bubbles around the top of the little CCD cameras. And I said, let me borrow your pen. So I took out this little envelope that keeps the lens tissues that I clean my camera lenses with. I drew a sketch and I said, is that what it looked like? He said, oh, you've seen one. I said, no. I said, I heard about this 5 years ago in 1988, and I never knew until this moment that it was true. I said, how did you happen to see it? I mean, did you work on it? He said, oh, no. He says, I was working late, late night shift. We had some things we needed to clean up on the aircraft that Bill was test flying. And he says, my boss came over and said, well, you know, we've got everything else done. He says, there's a mule over at North Base that needs to be picked up and brought back to the maintenance depot. Now, in the parlance of airmen working on the ramp, when you want to power up the flight control systems, the flaps and everything of an aircraft, and you don't want to be running the jet engine with the big exhaust blast, you know, or getting sucked into the engine or anything like that, what you do is you have a hydraulic ground power unit that you plug into a port on the side of the aircraft, and it powers up all of the hydraulic systems that normally would be driven by the engines. And it allows you to adjust and control all of the flight control systems on the aircraft, but without running the jet engine. And these things leak hydraulic fluid all over the place, and it stinks to high heaven, so it sounds like a mule, and that's why they call him a mule. So he was told to grab a tow vehicle and go over to North Base and get this mule, and as soon as he brought it back to the maintenance depot, he could leave for the rest of the night. Well, being, you know, a 19, 20-year-old kid, put two and two together, he says, well, you know, if I cut straight across the dry lake bed and don't take the perimeter road that goes all the way around the lake bed in this tow vehicle that's geared very, very low to be able to tow heavy things, he says, I can get there in probably 1/4 of the time, pick that thing up, bring it straight back. He says, I'll be able to go home in maybe 45, 50 minutes tops. That's what a kid thinks. And so that's what he did. Except that the security personnel at North Base were waiting for him at the gate. And so he goes trundling across the dry lake bed, up onto the tarmac, nobody there to meet him. And he had thought that the security was so tight that they would be right there to, you know, stop him at the edge of the cement. But they weren't. And so he goes rolling down the tarmac, looking for, you know, a ground power unit that needs to be worked on. And he sees a Quonset hut-style hangar a little ways down on the left with the doors cracked open. So he rolls down, stops in front of the opening. And what does he see inside the hangar? One of the alien reproduction vehicles hovering above the floor, no landing gear, just hovering there. And he was there for maybe 30 seconds before he heard footsteps running up behind him. And before he could even turn and look, someone had a rifle barrel at his throat and told him to get down on the ground or he was going to get his head blown off. And so they threw a hood over his head and they took him and they basically spent the better part of 18 hours debriefing him. And in the process, realized that what he had seen was so secret that there just wasn't any way that they could keep him as a lowly crew chief and expect him to keep his mouth shut. So they gave him much more responsibility. They moved him up into, I think it was called the Air Intelligence Agency, working with these boring black boxes that I told you about. But anyway, in the process of debriefing him, they told him even more about this craft than he was able to find out on his own. They told him that the upper and the lower crew sections, crew compartment, let me just go back to this real quick here. Forgive me again. that the upper and lower halves of that sphere capture this large coil that wraps around the circumference. That's actually the primary windings of a very large Tesla coil, millions and millions of volts of electricity. But you can kind of see the flanges if you look at it, like right here and right there. You can see where the top and the bottom halves come together, and they actually capture and hold that ring. It's a large coil embedded in quartz, a special kind of quartz. And in fact, the upper and lower halves of that crew compartment are held together with explosive bolts. And that in the event of a failure of the system and they have to eject, the top half of the crew compartment blows away, taking that central column, or I should say the outer sheath of that central column, with it. And because it's made of an entirely composite material, it can actually act as a rudimentary reentry shield as they come back through the atmosphere from low Earth orbit or whatever. And then one by one, the ejection seats ride the bottom half of that column drops away along with the flywheel, or what looks like a floor below the ejection seats there. And the ejection seats fire off of a set of rails that point straight down as this thing begins to descend through the atmosphere. And then they can deploy a parachute and so forth like that. But these were some of the things that he was told that he was never able to see on his own. Of course, he shared those with me. Now, let's see. Now, as time has gone on, and I've tried to figure out how the system works, there are a lot of technicalities and information that I could share with you that would probably be kind of boring in terms of the detail and what it really means. But basically, this is a system that produces a tremendous amount of electricity. And one always comes back to the question of how can these things accelerate from a standing stop and disappear like they've been fired out of a cannon? How can they be doing 9, 10, 12,000 miles an hour through the air, making right-angle turns, and no sonic boom? I mean, how is that possible? And so I had to try and sort out everything that I could find in the physics literature, and I actually wound up befriending a number of physicists like Tom Bearden, Tom Vallone, Hal Puthoff. I've talked to these people, David Froning. I've corresponded with some of these people, shared some of my ideas with them, and I found a surprising amount of agreement with these people who have brains that go far beyond mine in terms of being able to do all the mathematics. What I basically did was I would get their peer-reviewed papers from Physics Review, one of these peer-reviewed journals from the American Physical Society, and I would read all the paragraphs between the equations. It would explain what the equations were saying in mathematics, because I didn't understand the mathematics. But you could tell what was going on by the descriptions. And so I would ask these questions, and I would say, well, if this happens, does that mean you'll get this result? And more often than not, they were in agreement with me. And so, in a nutshell, the reason that these vehicles are able to do the things that they're doing, the reason they're able to make these incredible maneuvers, is because they have found a way to cancel their own mass. Now, for the layman, think of it as their weight. They can cancel their own weight. Now, in physics, and I'm only going to use a minimal amount of technical terms for you, but in physics there is an energy form that's embedded in the space-time around us everywhere. This particular energy is referred to in a number of different terms. It's called scalar energy, zero-point energy, quantum zero-point fluctuations of the vacuum. But basically, where it gets its name from, in the early research that discovered this particular energy form, they were, in the beginning, when they first began to discover how to make cryogenic fluids like liquid nitrogen or liquid argon and things like this, they would take these super-cooled fluids and they would then try to determine whether there was anything going on in these materials that they were cooling down to these extreme temperatures. Now, one of the things that happens when there's any kind of energy or warmth is you get all the molecules moving all around. It's called Brownian motion. But when you reduce something down to near absolute zero, where there is none of this Brownian motion at all, where everything just kind of stops moving because there's no heat energy left, there's still this charge. There's still this vibration in the material, and that's where it gets the name, zero-point energy, because it's something they find near absolute zero. And so the conclusions that have been made in the years since this was discovered is that zero-point energy is really sort of the power source for the entire universe. You know, we talk about the law of entropy in thermodynamics, and that's basically the idea that if you heat something up, it cools down because the heat dissipates. If you energize something, the charge dissipates. It goes away. It diffuses. It becomes less because it's dissipated into the environment. But the one thing that sticks out and is different from all of that is matter itself. Now, Einstein said that matter can neither be created nor destroyed. You can be changed to energy, and you can change energy to matter if you know how to do it. But if you look at an atom, I mean, if you were able to hold an atom and blow it up so you could see it, so it was this big, and you could see the electrons spinning all around the nucleus, with the protons and the neutrons and the electrons and everything moving. It's all in motion all the time, and it never slows down, ever. It never stops. Now, to me, that sounds like perpetual motion. We all know that's impossible, right? Well, it's not. And this is the thing, because this energy form that seems to boil up right out of another dimension is what keeps all those subatomic particles in motion all the time. That's where they get the power from. But it is that motion that creates the effect of mass. Now, people think, well, it has a certain mass and always stays the same. Well, no, that's not true. Mass is a variable effect. Now, Einstein said that when you accelerate through space-time, your mass increases. But most people don't sit back and say, well, why? Why does it do that? Mass increases because as you travel through the environment, the atoms of your vehicle interact at a higher rate with this energy that's embedded in the environment. And so in a sense, the electrons and the subatomic particles all become more and more energized because their interaction, their absorption of this energy increases. But when you decelerate, it's all dissipated again. Everything goes back to its normal mass. So we can see that this particular physical characteristic is a variable. It changes according to what's going on with the object. Okay. Now, we know this energy is out there. We can prove that it exists. And we know that it's responsible for the effect of mass. And Einstein said that you could never propel something up to and beyond the speed of light, because as you approach the speed of light, the mass begins to increase exponentially until it reaches nearly an infinite mass. You could never have enough propulsive power to accelerate, continue accelerating past the speed of light. And so everyone in physics, in the physics world, said, well, this is the reason why aliens could never be coming here from another world, because there's just no way they could reach the speed of light. They'd have to spend 12, 13 lifetimes just to get here from another star. Okay. Well, we know that you can absorb energy out of the environment and turn it into electricity because we have photovoltaic cells, solar cells, right? You can get sunlight, you can produce electricity. Well, suppose you found a way to take this zero-point energy right out of the environment as you're moving along. No fuel involved. You just absorb it out of the environment and you put it to work. So energy is conserved and no physical laws are broken. But if you can take that energy out of the environment and use it for propulsive force, the other thing that happens is that because it's being absorbed into your propulsion system through a mechanism like this, it's not left in the environment to interact with the material structure of your craft. And so what happens is the electrons and the subatomic particles, they start to slow down. All those strong and weak nuclear forces that hold everything together are still there, but the spin has slowed down. And in a sense, the material structure of the atom, the atoms throughout the entire vehicle, are slightly de-energized, as though the atoms were experiencing deceleration. But what's happening? You're using this energy to go faster. But the beauty of this is that as you go faster and faster, it means you have more and more of the energy you can draw from. And as you're doing so, the relative mass, the relative weight of your vehicle is being reduced further and further and further. So you're getting lighter and lighter the faster you go, and you have more and more energy to keep propelling yourself. And so in the end, what happens is you have a way of breaking the light speed barrier because you don't have to worry about anything growing in its mass, in the level of mass it has. Now, this is how I kind of explained it in my own mind, not having the ability to do all the physics equations. And I ran this whole idea past Hal Puthoff in a paper that I called The Feasibility of Interstellar Travel. And he sent me back a message saying that he felt that it was a tour de force on how this might be possible. So I went the next step, and I said, okay, well, if that's true, if you can demass or mass cancel an object so that it has none of the effects of mass, that means that there aren't any g-forces. Now, when I took these media orientation rides with the military, and traded paintings for rides in F-16s and F-15s and things like this with the military, I had a chance to put on a G suit and experience 7 Gs in an F-15, 9.3 Gs in F-16. And I can tell you that when your body follows an aircraft through an acceleration where it makes a sudden turn, your body basically wants to keep going straight, as like everything else in the aircraft. But the wings are so powerful they can turn the aircraft with such force that your body experiences up to 9.3 times its normal body weight. So I weigh 200 pounds, or at least I used to. That means that I would weigh almost 1,800 pounds sitting there in that ejection seat. And believe me, it starts to hurt. These fellows, most of them have necks like somebody from the WWF Wrestling League. I mean, honestly. And in fact, any good F-16 pilot will tell you that there's only two kinds of F-16 pilots. The ones that have messed up necks and the ones that are going to. Because they put those I mean, imagine if your head weighs 10 pounds and you pull 9 Gs. It's like your head weighs 90 pounds. It's like having a 90-pound kid hanging off your head. For those of you who are parents, you can understand and appreciate that. So I had the ability to experience this kind of thing, and I can tell you that the idea of making right-angle turns at 9,000 miles an hour, and I've personally seen this right here in Southern California. In fact, that particular sighting was 2 days after this event that occurred with the dogs howling and not being able to move. 2 days later, on the 13th, I was out on a date with my sweetheart. And just to give you an idea of how understanding she is, our anniversary was actually on December 11th, the night that I spent over at this abductee's house. And so 2 days later, we go out to celebrate this anniversary. And we leave the Ontario airport, the Red Line Inn where we had originally met, and we go up and we're sitting at the light on the overcrossing of I-10, which I think might be Vineyard Avenue, I'm not sure. But anyway, we're sitting at the light. It's a full moon. We're facing north, so you can see Mount Baldy, and it's, because it's December, there's snow on all the mountains, so everything's very clear, even though it's dark. And right in the middle of just sitting there at the light, this brilliant bluish-white bulb of light zips in from the southeast, drops down in front of the mountains, makes a right-angle turn, goes about 5 miles west, then makes another right-angle turn and goes up through Chaco Canyon, which goes right up near Mount Baldy. And this all happened in like a second and a half. And it was, a couple of days later, I went and I measured the distances, and I figured that according to how fast this occurred and the distance travel, it had to be somewhere between 7,000 and 9,000 miles an hour. No sound, absolutely silent. And it was flawless. I mean, there was never a moment where it slowed down or anything, just like that. And wouldn't you know it, I look over and say, "Did you see that? Did you see that?" And she's right in the middle of a yawn and missed the whole thing. The one time that I could have proved that my passion, and she's yawning and missed it. So, and that's probably happened to some of you too. I mean, you have these observations and you see these startling and unusual things, and then you look to someone to kind of validate your sighting, and you find that they were either asleep or yawning or taking a drink. Anyhow, over the years, I've had occasion to talk to a number of different people, scientists who've seen things, military people who've seen things. In fact, probably one of the most startling sightings of any that I've encountered was I went to the El Toro Marine Corps Air Station over here before it closed. I think it was one of the last major air shows they had in the early 1990s. And they had flown in this beautiful B-24 Liberator from the Second World War, and they'd polished the aluminum. It was the most if you like World War II aircraft, this had to be one of the most beautiful restorations I've ever seen in my life. And they had a cordon around it, and I'm standing there looking at this plane, and I'm just grinning from ear to ear. And I look over, and standing next to me is this gentleman was probably 65, 70 years old, and he's grinning just like I am. And I said, boy, she's a beaut, isn't she? He says, yeah. I said, man, you know, those were the days, huh? And he says, yeah. He says, I started my flying career in one of these. I said, really? So you were in World War II? He says, yeah, Pacific Theater. And he says, in fact, he says, I ended my flying career in the Pacific Theater during the Vietnam War, flying in a B-52. I said, really? What were you, pilot, navigator? He says, no, he said, he was a navigator. And I said, well, you know, this is wonderful. The B-52s are great, I mean, but that's really old technology. I mean, the stuff they've got now, I said, you wouldn't believe. I mean, I heard stories about things flying around over in the Persian Gulf. You wouldn't believe. He says, oh, yeah, I would. I said, what? I said, what are you getting at? He says, well, he said, I don't know if I can talk about it. And he looked all around. He says, the FBI's been after me for years. And I said, what are you talking about? I said, did you have a sighting? And he says, yeah, but he said, it's beyond anything you can imagine. And I said, well, tell me. So I told him a little bit about what I knew to kind of relax him a little bit, so he knew that I was kind of on the same level with him. And he says, well, we were over in Vietnam, and our plane got hit with some shrapnel from a surface-to-air missile from North Vietnam. And he says, we had to fly over to Guam for repairs. And he says, we were over there for 2 weeks while they patched up the bird. He says, we were on our way back to a base, I think he said in Cambodia, someplace. I don't remember where the base was. He said they were flying across the Pacific, southwestern Pacific, in the middle of the night, 1 o'clock in the morning, full moon. Seemed like that's a common element in some of these stories, but he says they were flying along, and he was just sort of checking out the parameters of the aircraft, making sure they were on course. And all of a sudden, somebody up in the pilot's compartment says, what the hell is that? He says, hey, come on up here, you get a look at this. So they all go up to the flight deck and look out the left side of the aircraft. And he said, here was this flying saucer pacing us. And he said, conservatively, it had to be between 1/4 mile and 1/2 mile in diameter. And I said, well, how could you tell? And he says, well, because the B-52 is shielded against electromagnetic pulses created by nuclear explosions when there's an actual, nuclear war, he says our electronics weren't affected by this. He said, so we could fly in really close. We got to fly all around this thing. And he says, none of our systems were affected by this thing. And I said, but how did you figure out how big it was? He says, well, he said, there was a dome on the top of it, a cupola kind of thing. And he says, we could count the number of stories because it was translucent like a glowing piece of lucite. And he says, you could see the silhouettes of all the little floors, and you could see little guys walking around with, the big heads and stuff, sitting at desks and doing stuff and working on things. And he says, we counted the floors, and there were 27 floors. So he says, we had an idea that this is a pretty big plane, or pretty big craft. But he described some of the other features. He said, basically, your typical lenticular disc. But he said that around the outer edge were a series of what looked like turbine blades. But he said each one of those turbine blades was 7 stories tall. And he says they were slowly orbiting around the circumference of this thing. And he said, we flew all around this thing. We got a good look at it. He said, we didn't have a camera that could photograph in low light like that back in those days. And he said that we moved off a little ways and we're looking at this thing, and all of a sudden, these turbine blades around the edge start going faster and faster and faster. And he says, now, if you can just imagine, he says, imagine a turbine blade the size of a hangar bypass door, moving so fast around the circumference of a craft, maybe somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 mile in diameter, but the blade's moving so fast you can't see them. Imagine the amount of power that it takes to do that. And he says, he said, this thing moved a little way off, and he says, then it went like that. And he said, this is the part that the FBI always bugs us about, is what we saw next. And I said, well, what was that? He says, well, he said, remember, it's 1 o'clock in the morning, full moon, we're over the ocean, not a cloud in the sky. And he says, in the wake of this craft is this shimmering tunnel of light with a day-lit blue sky with puffy clouds in it that we could see as this thing went away from us. And he said, and it persisted for several seconds after this thing left. He says, the only conclusion we could come to was that this thing was punching a wormhole through hyperspace and was coming out on the other side of the planet where the sun was shining. And that's why we could see the clouds, and then they disappeared. But he says that was the one thing that they really were interested in. Now, for any of you who've watched Star Trek and some of these other science fiction TV shows and things, you're probably familiar with the idea of space warp, warping space, time warps. Well, I've actually had occasion to see this particular phenomenon. I've had it described to me as appearing as though the sky is distorted and pulls back into a kind of tunnel, and then something would come out of it, stop momentarily, and then fly away. Now, that particular description was given to me by a scientist who works at JPL. And he was at White Sands during a test of some kind of weapon system when they actually saw this particular event. And it happened twice in the same location. This distortion in the sky. I mean, you know, even the appearance of the clouds and everything kind of gets sucked back up into this looks like an inverted funnel. It goes up to a dark spot with little stars in it. And this thing comes almost like a dot, comes out of it, and all of a sudden it's a flying saucer sitting right there, and then it goes away. It comes back a little while later, this manifestation of this wormhole reappears, and it goes up into the wormhole. Now, in 1993, right before I moved to Northern California, I went to an Angels baseball game in Anaheim with some kids from the neighborhood. We were riding in a car. I was in the front seat next to the young fellow who was driving. And I don't know why this happens, but the subject of UFOs came up. And we were talking about UFOs, and this one young fellow said that he thought he'd seen one. And there was a Santa Ana winds condition at the time, and so the planes that were landing at the Ontario airport were circulating in kind of that strange pattern where they have to come in and land from, I guess it's the west end of the field, whereas normally they would come in from the east. But because of the wind direction, they had to change that, and they were in this orbiting pattern. And I mentioned casually in passing, you know, it's amazing that those pilots are able to do all that stuff and never collide or have a collision, mid-air collision. All of a sudden, no sooner had I said this, there's a brilliant flash of light in the sky right over the airport. And out of that brilliant flash comes this glowing ball of light that got bigger and bigger and bigger as it descended. And I thought, oh my God, there's been a crash. And right behind it were these glowing, what I thought were glowing embers of debris that were following this thing down, but it was moving much more slowly than you would expect. And usually, if you've ever seen film footage of an aircraft that's been in a collision or crashed or has been shot down by a missile or something, you see bits and pieces of flaming debris, and there'll be flame and smoke and all this kind of stuff, and they go all over the place. But what was unusual about this event was that all of these glowing objects that were behind this thing that materialized in the sky were like parallel lines that moved without changing in position to one another. They were like parallel lines that all moved together in unison with this thing. Some of them were thick line weights, some were pencil thin, some were really quite large, but they were all sort of a golden yellow color. And they all sort of emerged from this one point in the sky. It was almost like there was an opening, and these things came out of the opening. I mean, one minute it's not there, the next minute it sort of just comes right out of it. And I was looking at this for the longest time, and I was trying to figure out what did I just see? This thing descends behind a distant hill. And then I remembered that there is this nature preserve south, I believe it's southwest of the Chino airfield. And they keep the place all closed up at night. They don't allow any people driving through there. It's all closed off to the public after dark. And that's exactly where this thing came down. And I had heard that there had been sightings in the area. So then I thought, well, maybe this was a UFO. And then when I thought of all of the other facts that had come to me over the years, it occurred to me that what I was seeing was an object that was just emerging from hyperspace. You know, because it was dark, I didn't see the distortion of the cloud and the skies and so forth. But then I had to try and explain, why are these parallel lines behind it? Now, if you remember the first Star Wars film, if you've ever seen a film like that, where they talk about making the jump to hyperspace, and they go off into this point in the sky where they begin to exceed the speed of light, you see all of the stars begin to become these long streaming lines that all radiate from the point that they're traveling towards. And they all become really bright, brilliant white. Well, if you know anything about the Doppler effect, and you know about light, one of the reasons they think that the universe is expanding is because the stars that are out there seem to be moving away from us, and when they do, the light frequency shifts towards the red. It's called the red shift. Okay, well, if you're traveling from a distant spot in the universe and you pop out of hyperspace in the Earth's atmosphere, and there's this same tunneling effect like the Navigator or the B-52 talked about, then it seemed like a perfect explanation to me that what I was seeing was a number of stars that the images had been streaked, just like at the initiation of the process, so also at the tail end of it. And the reason that the white light of the stars is a golden color is because it's red shifted towards a different frequency. And that's why all of these lines that I saw moved in unison as this thing descended. I mean, they did not change in relative position to one another at all. And that was the explanation I came up with. Now, as the years go by, it gets more and more difficult to, drive 800 miles down to Area 51 and hang out on a mountaintop and watch for something. It can chew up a tremendous amount of time, and believe me, I've done my share of that kind of stuff, as I'm sure some of you have as well. But sometimes you can find stuff right in your own backyard if you just know where to look. And part of making that happen, part of that process is being able to discern the difference between a conventional aircraft and something that's really unusual. Now, it's real easy to see a meteor and think, oh, that was a UFO. See how it came down. But usually meteors are very fast and they're very straight. And sometimes they'll even explode into little particles and they'll change color and stuff, and it'll look really fantastic, but it's not a UFO. Sometimes you'll see a satellite moving overhead, or even the International Space Station, which is quite noticeable if you happen to see it passing overhead. It's brilliant, brilliant white. But the real difference is being able to understand what these phenomenon, or what the kind of phenomena these objects produce when they are flying through the air. Now, one of the things that I've noticed more often than not, when one of these objects is moving along at a pretty good clip, is that there will be an ionization trail behind them that will persist for a number of seconds. Now, before I was talking about how these objects, when they move really fast, they don't produce any sonic boom. And a lot of people don't understand how that's possible. That just doesn't seem, I mean, if you have an object moving that fast through the air, it's got to produce a sonic boom. I mean, the space shuttle, when it comes back from space, is doing Mach 20. It produces a double sonic boom. So how is it possible that it doesn't produce a sonic boom? Okay, if you have an object like this, and it creates an area around itself where it is absorbing all this energy for propulsive forces, and in the process of doing that, it's canceling the mass of everything on the vehicle, including the pilot, who doesn't feel any G-forces at all when it turns suddenly. It's also true for a certain portion, a certain area around the vehicle where you'll get a kind of partial mass cancellation. You'll see the same kind of effect, that it will affect the molecules of air around the vehicle. And so what happens is, if a molecule of air is sitting here in the air and this thing comes flying along and it suddenly is mass canceled, if there's no mass, there's no inertia. If there's no inertia, that means that there won't be any resistance, any force, any drag, any friction on the surface of the vehicle as it's displaced. It'll be an absolutely frictionless reaction. It'll be displaced without any energy transfer whatsoever. And it's that energy transfer that produces a sonic boom. Because sound is kind of the measuring rod by which energy is transferred. I should say the speed of sound is the measuring stick by which energy is transmitted through the atmosphere. Now, the speed of sound through water is different because it's a denser solution, or it's a denser medium, I should say. But if you have the ability to cancel an air molecule, in effect, slowing down the motion of the subatomic particles of that molecule so that it's virtually massless, displaced without any kind of energy transfer while it's being displaced by the vehicle. And then the air, what happens afterwards? The air closes in behind the vehicle. But what happens after that? It leaves this region of space that is being mass canceled, and it suddenly reacquires that interaction with the zero-point energy that keeps the electron spinning. And what it does is it momentarily bounces to a higher energy level. It's like a bounce, you know, like when you throw a super ball down the ball, it comes back up again. And sometimes it'll go higher than what you expect. And so, in a sense, the electrons bounce back up to a slightly higher energy state than their normal steady state, is what it's called. And in the process of stabilizing and normalizing themselves, they re-radiate the excess energy as photons. And that's what the trail is that you see behind a UFO. And so, as you see these things zipping around, it literally looks like a whispery little comet tail that will persist. I mean, when these things are moving along, I mean, these comet tails at arm's length, you know, several miles away, they can be almost a foot long in terms of, you know, what you perceive out there in the distance. And they will persist for a number of seconds. Now, there's all kinds of things that you can determine about the way a propulsion system works by the way it manifests in the environment. But what I'd like to do now is maybe give each of you some ideas, some pointers about how, when you yourself go out and you're watching the sky, the things that you can do to look for the possibility of a UFO. Now, if you go out every time at 20 minutes past 10 and you see this little ball of light pass overhead, and it passes overhead every hour and a half in the exact same trajectory, pretty good chance it's a satellite. If it, on the other hand, comes rocketing in from an unusual direction and stops before it disappears, you have a pretty good idea that's not a meteor, because meteors never slow down. In fact, they go faster as they come into the atmosphere. Now, if you have an opportunity to bring along some binoculars with you, and this is something I would certainly advocate, when you're making your observations, always look for anything that would indicate that it's a conventional aircraft. There was a UFO watching party up in the high desert one time, and there were a group of people up there. It was off of West 190th Street, near the Tehachapi Mountains, northwest of Mojave, I think it was. Or no, excuse me, northwest of Lancaster and Palmdale. And there were people that swore that they had seen UFOs in this area, so they were all anxious to see something. And so I had a set of binoculars, and it was very, very windy out there, and I'm quietly listening to the observations that are being made by all the people standing around me. And I'm looking to the south, and I can see what I know are clearly the landing lights of aircraft coming into the Burbank International Airport. You know, because they're brilliant lights, there's usually pairs of them, if not, you know, in threes. And because the wind is howling around us, you know, your binoculars are moving like this. But that relative movement in the lens was being interpreted by everybody else as UFOs dancing. That's what they were seeing, is these lights doing this. They, oh, look at them dance, look at them dance. But it wasn't UFOs at all. It was aircraft, conventional aircraft landing at Burbank. Now, a little while later, they said, oh, look, there's a triangular UFO there. And so I swung around and looked, and I can see the three brilliant lights, the two big ones on the main landing gear, and the brilliant light on the nose gear of a C-141 Starlifter on its way into Edwards Air Force Base with its landing gear down. And the way I can tell is because on the right wingtip, because it's going from left to right, from the right wingtip I can see a blue light. But I can also see the lime green formation lights on the tail and on the sides of the body. But nobody else could see that because they didn't know what to look for. So these are the kinds of things that you have to be able to keep in mind when you're out there looking. You have to be objective, you have to be skeptical, you have to look at these things and know whether or not you're seeing something that's conventional. Now, if it's moving very fast, if it's not producing any kind of noise at all and it's making zigzag turns at extremely high speed, there's a pretty good chance that it's something exotic. So that's pretty much everything I have. I'd be happy to take questions from anyone, and I would certainly encourage you to engage other people, talk to them, because I think that as time goes on, you'll find that there are so many people out there that have incredible stories to tell. They just don't have anybody to tell it to, and maybe that could be you. And then maybe we can get a handle on some of these things. So, thank you.
Talk, Mark. Test. Okay, so does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? But yeah, yeah. So people.
I was just wondering why we couldn't see the rest of the pictures that you passed on the slide.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, actually, the pictures kind of diverted from the main part of the story. I could go through and explain to you what they are if you wanted. I don't know if anybody's interested in that, but that was a presentation that was put together by a friend of mine, a good another researcher by the name of Maјkl Šratу, who came into town and happened to have some of these the images that we've exchanged over the years. When we research and we talk about different kinds of advanced technology aircraft, these are some of the things that I've seen or that I've worked on or I've done conceptual artwork on. And so we had a certain commonality, and that, because of the fact that my flight coming into town was delayed for 3 hours, we really didn't have an opportunity to put together a series of images that would sequence with the story in the way that I felt that it needed to be told. And it's no fault of Mike's. It's just that you know, not all of those pictures had anything to do with what I was really intending to talk about, and I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yes, you met this man from Northern California. I think it's the Napa area. His name is Ed Beeler or something like that, and his specialty is looking at UFOs through night vision goggles.
I've heard of him. I've never met him.
Have you ever tried night vision goggles to see UFOs?
Well, no, I haven't, but I know other people whose reporting and observation skills I trust highly, and just about every single instance people have reported seeing unusual activity using night vision goggles. In fact, just this last summer, a friend of mine called me up and indicated that there were these unusual flashes in the sky. It looked like there was some kind of warfare or explosions or things going on in the air. And this was very similar to the stories that were being told by the gentleman that you're referring to. And so I went out and I spent several nights, and I found, and this is another example of where things all start coming together. I had done several appearances on Coast to Coast with Art Bell, and in the wake of those appearances got correspondence from people in Alaska who used to live in my area, some other individuals who live south of Redding in the community of Red Bluff. And these people were all saying the same thing, and none of these people knew one another, and they were all saying that there was a UFO base under Tom's Head Mountain, which is about, I would say, about 70 miles southwest of Redding. Now, it wasn't until I actually went and sat down and talked to one of the people that were making this claim that I was startled to find that not only were there UFOs in that area that were being sighted, but this gentleman actually had a large Polaroid photograph that he had taken of one of these objects. And again, it was a large black disc. And in this instance, it had what looked like green-colored fluorescent tubes around the outer edge that would sort of move, kind of like that sequence from Close Encounters of the Third Kind where the lights are moving around on the perimeter of the aircraft. That kind of thing. And in this instance, the photograph was taken at dusk. You could see this black saucer down in a valley. They're looking, this gentleman and his brother, looking down at this vehicle from an overlook. And you can see the pine trees below it that are dwarfed by the size of this craft. But the other thing that was interesting was that there were all these little red orbs that were floating out among the vegetation and had little laser beams that were scanning the plants like they were doing some kind of biological assessment of the environment. I mean, it was fascinating. And yet, these events that have been occurring in the sky, these kinds of explosions and things, seem to be a real phenomenon. I don't know what it's caused by, but there is something to it.
You said you've been interviewed by Art Bell.
Yes.
That had to have been quite some time ago.
Yes, yeah. More recently it was with George Norrie, who replaced him.
Oh, you have been interviewed by George Norrie?
Yes.
Well, he's the one that's been mentioning the night vision goggles.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm aware of that.
That was the first time he said he saw a UFO.
Is that right?
Yeah, but from this man in Northern California. I think it was at the UFO conference in San Jose.
Is that right?
Yeah, they went on top of the building at night and You say, come up and I'll show you where they are.
How exciting.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you.
Sure.
I was wondering if anybody has ever asked you this. Have you seen the orbs in your disclosure project interview? Do you know what I'm talking about? Because I can't imagine it's only my copy. I don't know how that would occur.
All right, are you talking about something that appears in the film from the disclosure project itself?
Yeah, it appears right over your right shoulder. It's like I think it was either 2 or 3 objects, small red and white little orbs. I think 1 or 2 of them even go behind a leaf.
Behind my shoulder
right
personally?
Behind you, and there's like some plants off to your right.
No, I've never seen that.
And they actually go like, you'd think it maybe is lens flare and the camera's not moving and you're indoors,
That's
so why would it be
fascinating.
lens flare? These things go behind the leaf.
I had
Nobody's
no
ever
idea.
seen that? Nobody's ever mentioned that?
No, no one's ever said
I
anything
could
to me
point
about
out, it's been a few years, but I could point out it's only like 4 seconds or something.
Well, I'll have to go back and review that. I will tell you, though, that for those of you who missed the May 2001 disclosure conference from the National Press Club, that about the first 45 minutes or so of that broadcast, which was one of the first and largest internet broadcasts in the history of the Press Club, was being jammed, and there were people from NSA who said unequivocally that they were responsible. Now, you have to wonder why anybody would want to suppress that kind of information, because basically it's just a bunch of people talking about the things that they've seen or the things they've been involved in. I had a discussion just recently with Dr. Gриer because, as you may know, he's got a number of programs. There was, of course, CSETI, and there was a disclosure project, and there was also, I think it's called the Orion Project, where they are trying to find a way to exploit this technology for the production of commercial energy, rather than relying on the fossil fuels coming out of the Middle East, which seem to be sponsoring and supporting so much terrorist activity around the world. Find a way to basically tell the Arabs to politely take their oil and do something else with it. Well, in the process of having the discussion with Dr. Gриer, he mentioned to me that he was taken aside by some members of this organization that is sometimes known as Majestic 12 or the Majestic Organization or just MAGIC. He was taken aside and told in the most simple terms that there is a conflict within the organization. There's a portion of these people that believe that this information must never be disclosed to the public. But there is a growing and now a larger portion of that same group that feels that without any doubt, because of the way the environment is going, the things that are happening around the world, the polar ice caps melting, for example, that it's absolutely necessary that this information be brought out. And that, it's possibly the one way we have of reversing the course of the climate change that we're seeing in the world. And the other thing that he was told was that the group that now represents the majority of this Majestic organization that believes that this information should come out is seeing to it that people like me and like Dr. Gриer are being protected from the people who don't want it disclosed. And so I find an interesting correlation between this, these orbs hovering in the background for whatever reason. It's kind of it gives one an odd sensation of feeling that you're being watched or being watched over, perhaps. And maybe that's a good thing. Thank you for your question. Yes, sir.
Quick, great presentation.
Thank you. I hope I didn't make it too complicated. I was trying to keep it as succinct as I could. But.
Real quickly, any more information on the girl and earthquakes?
Well, you're talking about the one who had the event in her home?
Yeah.
She has experienced multiple military abductions. She lives in the community of Sierra Madre, which is the same area where they park all the floats from the Rose Bowl parade at the end of Colorado Boulevard after the parade goes on. And she lives up in one of those canyons up there. And she has had experiences going on there for quite some time. I basically just scratched the surface with the experience that I had. But she indicated that on one occasion that she had a friend a gentleman and his wife who were both long-haul truckers that came and spent the evening with them. And the wife, because she always drove sort of the graveyard part of their schedule, usually would stay up at night reading and sleep during the day, because that's the way they maintained, you know, their ability to keep going over the long haul when they were driving trucks and cargo. So she's sitting in the living room, in exactly the same room that I was in when this event happened to me. And as she's sitting there reading in this recliner chair, suddenly in the middle of the room, this black panel opens up in the middle of the room, and around it has these segmented lights like white fluorescent bulbs. And this black panel is a strictly two-dimensional black nothingness hovering in the middle of the room. And emerging out of that blackness comes your stereotypical gray, steps out of it, looks over at her, immediately walks over and touches her on the forehead with a clear plastic, what looks like a clear plastic wand. And she's immediately immobilized like I was. So it makes me think that that's maybe what happened to me. I just never saw the wand for whatever reason. But that's just one event. You know, you always try to say, well, you know, maybe it was just a weird coincidence that the dogs were howling and I experienced this paralysis. Maybe it's not real. And a year or two later, in 1992, I was doing an overnight illustration job where I had to finish something in a real hurry, and I was up really late. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning. And I was living in Upland at the time. No, I'm sorry, I was living in Rialto at the time. And I went outside in the back to stretch, you know, and get some fresh air, and I was looking at the stars. And as I'm looking up at the stars, I see this little ball of light come across the sky, make a right angle turn, and go off in the direction of Sierra Madre at 2 in the morning. So the next morning, I called up this young lady and I said, hey, I got something to tell you. And she said, no, wait. I got something to tell you. I said, what? She says, they were here last night. I said, no kidding. I said, what time? She says, about 10 minutes after 2. And then I knew. I said, well, guess what? I think I saw them on the way to your house. You know, I mean, but it was an unrehearsed. It wasn't, you know, I wasn't giving her any cues. I wasn't dropping hints about what I saw. I just, well, tell me what you got, knowing what I knew already. So,
we've got one more, and then we'll turn the lights on.
Okay.
I was just wondering, how do you know that when you're seeing these ships or whatever, that it's not just the government's ARVs?
Well, that's a very good question. And my answer to that, and this is just based on my own observations over the last 28 years or so, is that I would say about 85% of them probably are just exactly that, government projects. In fact, one of the sightings that I don't think I had an opportunity to show, you know, it's funny, I didn't see that photograph in here, Mike. And it's probably near the end. There was a friend of mine, there it is, right there, a friend of mine, who in 1982 was out near the community of Cedarville, California. And he saw these cars parked on the side of the road, and there were people standing there looking at this thing in the distance. And he said, here was this huge black thing. Now you can just barely see it right there. Now that was scanned right here in this room from the original little tiny Polaroid photograph. Now, this occurred in 1982. Now, the husband of the lady who owns the copyright to this took this photograph, and he said that at the time, now this was kind of based on my looking at this object through a loop under extreme magnification, and these are some of the details I was able to pick up based also on some of the sketches that the eyewitness actually did. But if you look at the time frame, 1982, you find that this has some of the features that would later show up in the stealth fighter. All of these triangulated panels, these flat panels that reflect radar energy away and make the aircraft stealthy and invisible to radar. And based on some of the descriptions, each of those domes that you see on there kind of looks like the upper half of the alien reproduction vehicle. So maybe, just maybe, this is Lockheed's answer to an advanced technology bomber system, and that it's incorporated something that it's already built into the propulsion system. Now, the eyewitness who took the Polaroid, took this photograph, said that these people you see in this photograph here represent kind of a cross-section of our society and how they would react to a situation like this. And what he said was, some people were standing there hooping it up like they were watching a 4th of July fireworks show, hooping and hollering and enjoying it. Some were running across the field, waving at this craft, which he said was almost 600 feet in length. It was about a half a mile away. That it was so powerful, whatever was propelling this thing was so powerful that it was making a deep, pulsing hum that you could feel in your chest, even from that distance. And he said that there was another group of people that were on their knees crying and praying fervently for God to deliver them from the chariot of the devil. And I know that sounds funny, but you have to understand that when people see something like this and they can't explain it, and it's completely outside the realm of their understanding, you can get a broad spectrum of reactions. And that's part of the reason why it's so difficult to talk about some of this stuff with people who've seen things but are scared. And it's the ability to talk to them, keep them calm, and bring it out, bring those details out, that helps us find out most of the stuff, the kinds of things that I've been able to be able to find out myself. So.
Okay, I think that wraps it up nicely, and we'll turn the lights on. You can have further questions with Mike personally. Thank you so much, Mark.